Thank you, colleagues. The next item of business is Stage 3 proceedings on the Prisoners Early Release Scotland Bill. In dealing with the amendments, members should have the bill as amended at Stage 2, that is Scottish Parliament Bill 53A, the marshalled list, and the groupings of amendments. The division bell will sound and proceedings will be suspended for around 5 minutes for the first division of the Stage 3. The period of voting for the first division will be 45 seconds, and thereafter I'll allow a voting period of 1 minute for the first division after a debate. Members who wish to speak in the debate on any group of amendments should press their request to speak buttons or enter RTS in the chat as soon as possible after I call the group. And members should now refer to the marshalled list of amendments. And we move to Group 1, power to make determinations in relation to persons transferred to Scotland. I call Amendment 1 in the name of the Cabinet Secretary, grouped with Amendment 4. Cabinet Secretary to move Amendment 1 and speak to both amendments in the group.
Presiding Officer, these are amendments of which I gave members notice when speaking to Group 2 at Stage 2. Amendments 1 and 4 are technical amendments to ensure that any event that a prisoner serving a sentence out with the UK is transferred into a Scottish prison to serve the remainder of a short-term sentence, and that sentence is for the equivalent of a sexual or domestic abuse offence, they will definitely be excluded from the change in release point and instead continue to be released at the halfway point. Such transfers are uncommon. There are currently no prisoners in custody in Scotland who fall into this category. However, I have been clear throughout this process that the changes made should not apply to those serving a sentence for sexual offences or domestic abuse, and these amendments will ensure that the bill captures every case in which these exclusions should apply. The amendments will allow the Scottish Ministers to determine for any prisoner transferred to Scotland from abroad that they are to be treated for the purposes of release as though they are serving a sentence for a sexual offence or domestic abuse offence committed in Scotland. This determination will be carried out as part of the transfer process and will be based on information received about the facts and circumstances of the case. The amendments include a narrow regulation-making power to enable further changes to be made, subject to Parliament's approval, to ensure that the solution operates correctly within existing processes and is consistent with all relevant legislation. It should be noted that these amendments concern prisoners transferred from outside of the UK. In the case of prisoners transferred to Scotland from other parts of the UK, different legislation applies and they would be transferred on the basis that their release is determined by the law of the part of the UK which sentenced them. As a result, no provision needs to be made in relation to them. I would emphasise again, Presiding Officer, that this issue regarding transfers from abroad is not expected to arise often and indeed is not relevant to anyone currently in custody. However, it is important that we ensure the provisions of the bill apply as intended and to future-proof this to encompass all foreseeable circumstances. So I urge members to support these amendments which ensure consistency across the bill, and I move Amendment 1.
Thank you, Cabinet Secretary. There are no further requests to speak, so I would ask the Cabinet Secretary to wind up.
Wound up and moved.
Thank you, Cabinet Secretary. The question is that Amendment 1 be agreed to. Are we all agreed? Yes. We are agreed. We move to Group 2, Statement in connection with power to change release point. I call Amendment 2 in the name of Sharon Dowie, grouped with Amendment 2A. Sharon Dowie to move Amendment 2 and speak to both amendments in the group.
Thank you, Presiding Officer. As I said earlier, I was disappointed the Government did not support my amendments. However, I'm pleased that they've worked with me on this amendment for Stage 3 and also with Paula McNeill on Amendment 2A, which we will also support. This amendment will require that if ministers are to make any changes to these regulations, they must make an oral statement to Parliament which would set out their reasons for making the changes. I'm grateful to the Minister for working with me and I move the amendment in my name.
Thank you, Ms Dowie. Pauline McNeill to move Amendment 2A and speak to both amendments in the group.
Thank you, Presiding Officer. Amendment 2A is an amendment to the amendment that Sharon Dowie just moved there. It's what information will be available to victims about the change in the draft regulations would make if approved on the release of prisoners under the provisions amended by the regulations. As said in the previous Stage 2 debate, we would have wanted more information out of this to satisfy the public and victims of the changes and how they impact on communities. However, I do recognise that the Government was prepared to work with myself and Sharon Dowie on this, and on that basis I will move my amendment.
Thank you, Ms McNeill. I call on the Cabinet Secretary.
Officer, I am pleased that Parliament approved Amendment 21 in the name of Maggie Chapman at Stage 2. This requires the Scottish Ministers to consult organisations providing support to victims as well as key delivery partners before regulations changing the release point can be made. As I said at Stage 2, I was also willing to work with members to see what further could be done to ensure that Parliament is updated regarding any proposed regulations under the power. I support Amendments 2 and 2A in the names of Sharon Dowie and Pauline McNeill. Taken together, this would require the Scottish Ministers to seek to make an oral statement to Parliament on laying the regulations, which sets out the reasons for making the regulations, the consultation undertaken and the information that will be available to victims about the changes made if approved. While we would, of course, have always intended to keep Parliament updated, I think this is an appropriate and proportionate approach which will provide further reassurance on that point. And I would like to thank very much both Sharon Dowie and Pauline McNeill for the constructive discussions we have had about how we might further strengthen the process for making regulations under the powers in the bill. And I urge members to support both Amendments 2 and Amendment 2A.
You, and I call on Sharon Dowie to wind up on Amendment 2.
Wound up and moved.
Thank you, Ms Dowie. I call on Pauline McNeill to wind up and press or withdraw Amendment 2A.
I'd like to press on Amendment 2A.
Thank you. The question is that Amendment 2A be agreed to. Are we all agreed? Yes. We are agreed. I now call on Sharon Dowie to press or withdraw Amendment 2 as amended.
Press.
Thank you. And the question is that Amendment 2 as amended be agreed to. Are we all agreed? Yes. We are agreed. And we move to Group 3, removal of new power to change release point. I call Amendment 3 in the name of Martin Whitfield in a group on its own. Martin Whitfield to move and speak to Amendment 3.
I'm very grateful, Presiding Officer, and I don't intend to entertain, if that is the right word, the Chamber with regard to this amendment for any undue length of time, save to say that this Parliament exists as a single chamber on which it relies on either a committee or indeed this chamber to act as the second voice at times, to point out errors, to point out omissions, to point out areas that may potentially lead decisions that are taken here to unknown circumstances further down the line. In the Stage 2, the challenge of dealing with long-term prisoners within this bill was articulated, and I don't need to add to that. I really merely wish to give the Cabinet Secretary the opportunity, given the unicameral nature of this Parliament, to think again on this matter, and I move the amendment in my name.
Thank you. I call Liam Kerr.
Thank you, Presiding Officer. I rise to speak in support of Amendment 3. There's little I can add to my remarks from earlier or the sage analysis of Martin Whitfield on the unicameral Parliament and the importance of the process. So all I'll reiterate is that this provision, as it's in, doesn't serve the same purpose as the rest of the bill. What it does do is reduce scrutiny where previously a year had been required by this Parliament on a similar provision. And in circumstances that we find ourselves today where the Government has only recently conducted a shortened consultation on similar proposals which were withdrawn in the face of the evidence. So it does look less like prudent legislating and more like opportunism. It is so important a point that Martin Whitfield has made that the opposition have raised this at every single opportunity during the passage of this process to assist the Government in producing a competent bill. For that reason, I will support the Amendment 3 in the name of Martin Whitfield.
Thank you. And I call Liam MacArthur.
Thank you, Presiding Officer. Just to briefly concur with the comments both from Martin Whitfield and from Liam Kerr in the Stage 1 debate on Thursday last week, I made, I think, very much the same points as they have made, that while accepting the urgency of the situation and therefore, in a sense, the need for emergency legislation, what concerned me most was the far-reaching, wide-ranging powers that were being taken under Section 3 in this bill, and for myself and for my party, that is a step too far in this legislation. So I would again, like Martin Whitfield has just done, ask the Cabinet Secretary, even at this late stage, to think again and support the amendment that Martin Whitfield has lodged. Thank you.
Thank you. I call the Cabinet Secretary.
Presiding Officer, I do of course acknowledge the strength of feeling and views expressed by some members of this chamber. I have already set out the reasons that I believe it's necessary to update the current powers which Scottish ministers have to amend the point of release using subordinate legislation. The regulations would be subject to affirmative procedure, which means they cannot become law without being approved by a vote of the whole Parliament. This will also provide opportunity for committee scrutiny. As I made clear, we do not plan to make any change to long-term prisoner release until the detailed work has been carried out to ensure that those released can be safely managed in the community. There was support in principle amongst justice agencies, but there was acknowledgement amongst those consulted and indeed myself that there is merit for further exploration, but powers will not be used until if and when all issues are resolved. I have supported amendments which will guarantee consultation is carried out and that Parliament is kept updated in order to inform full scrutiny. I do know that not all members agree on the way forward here, but within the context of a high prison population, we need to ensure that a wide range of options is available, and I consider it of vital importance that this power is now restored.
Thank you. And I call Martin Whitfield to wind up and press or withdraw Amendment 3.
I'm very grateful, Presiding Officer, and I would share my disappointment that even at this late stage, the opportunity to think again has not been taken on something that does not directly relate to the overcrowding or the urgency with which this bill has been presented to this chamber. But I sense the view of the Government, and although I don't agree with it, I appreciate it, and therefore I would seek leave to withdraw the amendment.
Thank you. Martin Whitfield seeks to withdraw Amendment 3. Does any member object? No member objects. Therefore, Amendment 3 is withdrawn. I call Amendment 4 in the name of the Cabinet Secretary, already debated with Amendment 1. Cabinet Secretary to move formally.
Formally moved.
Thank you. And the question is that Amendment 4 be agreed to. Are we all agreed? We are agreed, and we move to Group 4, Reporting on Operation of Act. I call Amendment 5 in the name of Jamie Green, in a group on its own. Jamie Green to move and speak to Amendment 5.
Thank you, Presiding Officer. Can I first of all thank everyone who's helped us get through this evening, particularly our office staff and the Parliament's legislation team who have worked tirelessly. I think we all owe them a huge amount of gratitude in the circumstances that we've put them in, particularly for allowing me to be able to submit a late amendment at Stage 3. I've also been asked to keep my comments brief because I know Brian Whittle's desperate to get to the gym. He told me on the way in. Not sure I believe that. I'd like to speak to this amendment, which is on reporting of the Act. I did give some hints that I might submit something of this nature. I'd like to explain quickly what it does. This amendment would require Scottish ministers to report as soon as possible following 2 years of the changes being enforced to produce a report on the operation of the Act. Effectively, what effect this bill has had on the prison population itself, which is a point I raised in earlier stages. But importantly, it also requires ministers to publish the number of individuals released in each release period, broken down by the offence for which they were detained in the first place. Arguably, this could or should have been in the bill in the first place, but it does provide any future Parliament, I think, the bare minimum required to scrutinise this legislation in some way. It provides a mechanism to do so. But I also should be clear about what it does not do. It is not a sunset clause, as many of us would like to have seen in the bill. It is not indicative of any analysis that any harm that the bill might do to public safety. It will do nothing to analyse offenders' rehabilitation, or that the effect will have, the bill will have on victims of crime themselves, and importantly on reoffending rates, which is an issue that has been raised repeatedly. It's not quite enough, nor does it give any future Parliament the ability to revoke the measures in this bill. These are all things that we would like to have seen, and perhaps with more time we could have compromised further with the government on it. But we are where we are. It's the best we could do in the circumstances. This amendment will, interestingly, take us into the next parliamentary session. A new government and perhaps a new Parliament. And might I make, in closing, a suggestion to that future Parliament? Some of us here today may form part of that Parliament, some of us may not. But I do make this plea, because what this bill has done today is shone a light on the fact that somebody somewhere needs to do a full end-to-end piece of work on sentencing in Scotland, both as a means of punishment and rehabilitation. We might find in future debates there is much common ground in how we tackle our prison population and how we deal with reoffending, or how we keep people out of prison in the first place. We need to stop tinkering with sentencing in the way that we are doing today. The endless eroding and erasing of the meaning and the efficacy of sentencing. Because the government at the moment seems to be embroiled in a never-ending task of putting out fires without being able to identify the root cause of them. And that has got to stop. That's not how we make good law. And that's not the justice system that I want us all to be proud of, and which importantly meets that test of proportionality and fairness in the eye of the public. I urge members to vote for my amendment. Thank you.
Thank you. And I call Pauline McNeill.
I would like to join with Jimmy Green and the Parliament to commend our staff and the legislation team and all those who have made this emergency legislation possible. I have to say, to Presiding Officer, I was slightly frustrated at the rushed element to the process, because I had intended to add my name in support, and I had intended to raise the question that Victim Support had asked us to raise, which was information around the insertion of information about the use of the policy and the number of those offenders who were released. However, due to the rush process, I wasn't able to do that. However, despite that, I am supporting this amendment. Like Jamie Green, we did consider that a sunset clause would be appropriate in a case like this because, as said in the Stage 2 debate, a crisis is a short-term issue, and this is a permanent regulation, and we do not know when or if it will ever come to an end, and therefore I think a sunset clause would have been appropriate. But at least the amendment does allow a future Parliament to reflect on whether the policy has achieved its aims and to analyse the information contained within it. So I welcome that, and as Jamie Green has also said, I think it's very important that a future Parliament has a close look at this to see whether or not it has achieved its aims, and to look at the analysis of which prisoners have been released and what offences have been committed, so our future government can make a decision as to whether or not we should revert the policy back to 50% early release as was. Thank you.
Thank you. And I call the Cabinet Secretary.
Presiding Officer, if I can just advise Mr Dean that in the not too distant future I hope to be updating Parliament with respect to the independent sentencing and penal review that I'd advised Parliament last year of my intentions of, and just to say that I do of course acknowledge some of the frustrations that Pauline McNeill has articulated, and I have absolutely no doubts that we will return to many of these issues in the weeks and months ahead. As this bill is one step, it is certainly not the final step. Presiding Officer, I recognise the important role of the Parliament in scrutinising the impact of this bill and the significant public interest in the impact of a change to the release point for short-term prisoners. I therefore support Jamie Green's amendment that would require Scottish ministers to lay a report before the Scottish Parliament as soon as possible, 2 years following commencement. This supports our commitment to actively reviewing the need for the changed release point, as well as reviewing more generally the impact of this change. The amendment would require the Scottish Government to include specific information within the report, including the prison population throughout the review period, and for the initial tranches of release, a breakdown of the offences for which prisoners were detained and the number of prisoners released within each local authority and health board. In relation to reporting on those released within the initial tranches immediately following commencement, I agree it is important to closely monitor the impact of those releases, and that is why I also commit to separately publishing information within 2 months of the end of the last tranche. This information will include how many victims were notified of release. This reflects the information that was published following emergency early release in the summer. Following the initial tranches of release, as I've previously said, releases will be managed in the normal way through business as usual processes. I consider this reporting requirement to be proportionate in keeping the impact of the change under review and in giving Parliament the opportunity to scrutinise the effectiveness of this change. If required, secondary legislation could then be used to make further changes to the release point, depending on the content of that report. Thank you.
Thank you. And I call Jamie Green to wind up and press or withdraw Amendment 5.
Thank you. Can I thank Pauline McNeill for adding her at least verbal support, if not written support, for the amendment. And I share her frustrations. I too, my office, were working closely with Victim Support Scotland until late into the evening, trying to do our best to amend the bill at this late stage. This amendment was submitted 90 seconds before the deadline, so we just simply had run out of time. So I make an apology to them directly, but we will do our best to still listen to their concerns, and I hope the Cabinet Secretary will do the same in her engagement with stakeholders around this bill. And I'll maybe end in a point of consensus with the Cabinet Secretary. She talked about the huge public interest in this bill. Well, she's absolutely right. There is huge public interest in what we're doing in this respect. And I think it is that which should remain at the forefront of our minds in voting this evening, and I'll speak more about that in the closing speeches. Thank you, Presiding Officer, and I'm happy to move the amendment.
Thank you. And the question is that Amendment 5 be agreed to. Are we all agreed? Yes. We are agreed, and that ends consideration of amendments. As members will be aware, at this point I'm required under standing orders to decide whether or not, in my view, any provision of a bill relates to a protected subject matter. That is, whether it modifies the electoral system and franchise for Scottish parliamentary elections. In the case of this bill, in my view, no provision of the Prisoners' Early Release Scotland Bill relates to a protected subject matter. Therefore, the bill does not require a supermajority to be passed at stage 3. Before we move to the Stage 3 debate, I am minded to accept a motion without notice under Rule 11.2.4 to move decision time to approximately 9 p.m. And I invite Jamie Hepburn, on behalf of the Parliamentary Bureau, to move the motion.
Move, Presiding Officer.
Thank you, Minister. The question is that decision time be moved to approximately 9 p.m. Are we all agreed? Yes. We are agreed. The motion is therefore agreed. And the next item of business is a debate on motion 15603 in the name of Angela Constance on Prisoners Early Release Scotland Bill at Stage 3. And I remind members that, as per Rule 11.3.1h of Standing Orders, the question on this motion will be put immediately after the debate. I invite members who wish to speak in the debate press their request to speak buttons. And I call on Angela Constance to speak to and move the motion. Up to 7 minutes, Cabinet Secretary.
Thank you, Presiding Officer. The purpose of this bill is to allow for changes that will relieve some of the acute pressure currently being experienced within our prisons due to the high population. We all know the consequences of the high prison population, not least on the staff who work around the clock in our prisons. They are on the front line of the Scottish Prison Service and carry out dedicated and formidable work day in, day out. And I want to put on record my appreciation and heartfelt thanks to them. In a letter received by the Criminal Justice Committee from the Prison Officers Association this week, they reported that their members are increasingly concerned that, and I quote, the crucially important relationship between staff and prisoners that allows them to share those confined spaces in a way that allows good order, discipline and productive rehabilitation work to be undertaken are being put at risk. And the Prison Governors Association have also written to committee in support of this bill and have highlighted the necessity for the prison population to be reduced in the short, medium and longer term. And the purpose of this bill is to do just that. The change to the point of release for most short-term prisoners will be for those currently sentenced and those to be sentenced in the future. This will provide immediate relief to the pressures our prisons are facing. The initial release of an estimated 260 to 390 prisoners will be managed in 3 tranches over 6 weeks from February 2025. Importantly, as this is a permanent change, there will then be a sustained reduction to the sentenced population, with estimates that the sentenced population will remain around 5% lower than it would have been without this change. We need the prison system to focus on those who pose the greatest risk to the public and provide a range of support to help reduce reoffending and integration back into the community. Of course.
Martin Whitfield.
I'm very grateful to the Cabinet Secretary to take an intervention. She mentioned there the potential of up to 3 tranches of prisoners effectively to take the backlog before the bill. Has there been any thought given as to how those tranches will be made up? Will it be geographic? Will it be time served? What are the thoughts of the Government in relation to that?
Cabinet Secretary.
So this was actually referenced in the policy memorandum. It's not in relation to geography because there's a retrospective nature to the bill, that once the bill commences there will be people who are already eligible for release, but they cannot all be released at once. So therefore you release those who are closest to their liberation date, obviously post their new liberation date, and therefore it goes forward in that fashion. Presiding Officer, the bill includes built-in exceptions for those serving sentences for sexual offences or domestic abuse. And I have recognised throughout this process that I totally understand victims and their families may be concerned about the changes that we are making. And that is why we are already working with victim support organisations and providing them with clear information about the bill, so that those who are seeking assistance can be well supported. And I will also work with those organisations to encourage people who want to have information on prisoners in their cases to sign up to the victim notification schemes if they so want to do so. And this is ahead of future reforms to the service that the Minister for Victims, Siobhan Brown, will bring forward at stage 2 of the Victims, Witness and Justice Reform Bill. I do, of course, Presiding Officer, acknowledge the differences of opinions in and around the subordinate regulation powers in respect to long-term prisoners. I'm not going to repeat what I have now said at both stages 1 and stages 2, other than that I hope I've been clear throughout the process that it is of vital importance that this power is now reinstated so that we can act flexibly to manage the prison population in the future, and continue to work with partners to find a better balance between time spent in custody and under supervision in the community. This was widely supported in the consultation on the release of long-term prisoners we held in the summer, and I fully accept that more detailed work needs to be done before, if and when, any proposals are brought forward. And I also welcome the constructive amendments made during stages 2 and 3, which will ensure that any use of these regulation-making powers is subject to consultation and Parliament is provided with information to inform their later scrutiny. Presiding Officer, provisions within this bill allow for the prison population to be reduced at pace and for this reduction to be maintained, but have recognised throughout that this legislation alone cannot solve the complex issue of why we have one of the highest prison populations in Western Europe. What it does is create vital space within our prison system now, which will be maintained. This will allow for the medium-term measures, such as enhanced processes for release and home detention curfew, and ongoing work to encourage more widespread use of alternatives to remand for those endeavours to have an impact. It will also allow the prison service to more effectively support those in their care, contributing to a longer-term reduction in reoffending. As I have said, we cannot ignore or tolerate the position our prisons are currently in due to the high and complex population. The final form of the bill is needed to give clarity to the prison service, community partners, victims and those who will be released in order for the process of implementation to begin. Agreeing the bill tonight will allow for the changes to be made as quickly as possible, providing relief to our prison service and staff, and I move that Parliament agrees that the Prisoners' Early Release Scotland Bill be passed. Thank you.
Thank you, Cabinet Secretary. I now call on Liam Kerr to open on behalf of the Scottish Conservatives. Up to 6 minutes, please.
Thank you, Presiding Officer. So, after 2 days' scrutiny, 5 working days after MSPs, Civic Scotland and crime victims saw it, MSPs now consider whether to pass a bill which will automatically release short-sentence prisoners after they've served only 40% of their time in a permanent change, and ensure that when the government wants to do the same for long-term prisoners, it can do so through subordinate legislation. But it may also threaten victims' personal safety, jeopardise public safety, fail to deal with rehabilitation and reintegration, load pressure and cost onto councils, the third sector and all justice organisations, whilst costing the taxpayer a huge amount of money. And we know that when ACC mayors warned that those being freed before serving their full sentences would go back and start offending again, he's right. Let us not forget that in an earlier panicked release, over 40% reoffended within 6 months. Last summer's programme saw 1 in 8 criminals back inside after only weeks. Now, the government wants to suggest this is about relieving a prison system bursting at the seams, but really it's about the SNP's failure over 17 years to develop a proper, holistic strategy around the justice ecosystem, to build new prisons or get the staffing and resourcing right in those that we have, to properly investigate safe alternatives to custody, to properly examine the prison population to ascertain whether all should be being accommodated, to deal with a remand population that yesterday's Prisons Inspector report flags as a key issue. Presiding Officer, if it were simply about relieving pressure short term, there would be a sunset clause, as Pauline McNeill spoke powerfully about at Stage 2 and at Stage 3 amendments, or the reversion provision that Jamie Green tried to amend in earlier, but was defeated. Or the government would have conceded that the moving of long-term prisoner release to regulations in a unicameral parliament is opportunistic and, dare I say, sinister, and would have accepted my amendment and that of Martin Whitfield in Stage 3 to give that section full and proper scrutiny. And on the amending process, despite all the examples of poor legislation over the last few years, this government was so confident that it got its drafting spot on first time that it submitted not a single amendment at Stage 2. Then, belatedly realising that it had missed something on international prisoner transfers, it amended in what is an important and sensible amendment at Stage 3, begging the question, which MSPs should be carefully asking themselves, if they miss something like this in the rush to legislate and the failure to interrogate, it is surely possible that something else has been missed along the way. Meanwhile, whilst the Cabinet Secretary states public safety remains my absolute priority, the Governor's veto, so demonstrably a key aspect of keeping the public safe previously, when it was used to block the release of 178 prisoners deemed an immediate risk to specific persons or members of the public, is not in this bill. And the Government voted down sensible amendments on it earlier, risking public safety on the back of weak arguments around diverting resources and inability to plan. And when the 390 criminals are set free, remember the fiasco last summer, which saw only 2% of victims notified, and Martin Whitfield's specific challenge at stage 2 around notification of child victims. Well, the Government says that's being dealt with. But a response yesterday to my written question, in which I asked how much the new Victim Contact Centre would cost and whether this would be cannibalised from funds allocated to victim support organisations or other third sector partners, met with no direct answer. And instead, it simply says it will use resources already in the system. Presiding Officer, this Government finds itself in an entirely predictable situation of its own making following its 17 years overseeing Scottish justice. Everyone understands that their term in office has left our prisons bulging at the seams. But forcing through a bill with insufficient scrutiny, hoping that by the time the prisoners are released and long-term prisoners are being considered, people will have moved on, is, as Jamie Green said earlier, no way to make law. The Government has failed to make the case for why this bill, why now, and why under this procedure. Everything has been about getting it through in preference to getting it right. But at decision time, no doubt its MSPs will fall into line and help the Government rather than the public. I, on the other hand, will not vote for a bill which endangers the people of Scotland, betrays victims, grabs power from Parliament to the executive and fails our justice agencies, our hard-working prison staff and third sector organisations, whilst failing to deliver any meaningful solution to the situation. So at decision time tonight, I shall vote against the Prisoners' Early Release Bill. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr Kerr. I now call on Polly McNeill to close on behalf of Scottish Labour. Up to 5 minutes, please.
It is a sad day for criminal justice that today we are faced with the prospect of reducing the point at which prisoners serving short-term sentences are going to be released back into the community at 40% of sentence served, as Liam Kerr says, with no Governor's veto to provide a safeguard. This will be the case for the foreseeable future. It is acknowledged by Scottish Labour that there is a crisis in our prisons due to consistently high numbers in recent times. But as we said from the beginning, we do not think it merits emergency legislation and a permanent change in prison policy. We'd also like to put on record our appreciation, as the Cabinet Secretary has done, for the remarkable work of prison officers, governors and Theresa Medhurst and her team for the work that they do on a daily basis. Early release was always a controversial policy because of public concern and the lack of understanding about what early release amounted to, that prisoners do not serve their full sentence. But now they'll be even more alarmed because they'll serve less than their sentence, 40% for those prisoners. The issue of pre-planned release and reducing offending it was an important part of the Stage 2 debate, for which I am grateful for those who took part in it. Whilst the Government didn't accept my amendment, I'll continue to press for progress on this. I am not convinced that the work that has been done is yet sufficient to make this system ready for this release programme. I don't think we've had enough time to consider the implications for victims and how they could be better notified of those who are released who have offended against them. It is a short-term fix for current problems, and we do not know how long the crisis will last, but the policy will remain. Whilst the spike in the prison population might be recent, there are going to be longer-term issues that do need resolving. For example, as I've raised many times in the Criminal Justice Committee, the capacity in Burlington Prison in Glasgow was always difficult to manage consistently over the years, and those prisoners have been doubling up in cells for many years. We must see the modernisation of the prison estate. But I want to now address the question of Section 3, both speeches by Martin Whitfield and Liam Kerr, which I wholeheartedly agree with, because it is this part to which, as Martin Whitfield has said, relates to what we see as being two bills within this emergency legislation. The substantive part of this bill gives powers for the government to potentially radically change how we release those prisoners serving 4 years or more. Scottish Labour and the Scottish Tories did try to remove that section of the bill on the basis that it does require much closer scrutiny and should have been subject to the normal three-stage process within this Parliament for which it stands on the principle of devolution. When the policy was changed in 2015, it was probably not fully appreciated, and I have to say I'm one of those that didn't fully appreciate that prisoners serving long sentences after 2015 would no longer be released at the two-thirds way of through their sentence, but up to 6 months before release. Fully do now know this. But was it not obvious when the policy was changed then that it would lead to an increase in the prison population, and that there would be capacity would be an issue? If prisoners serving much longer sentences than they previously did, it's obvious, but no plans were made for it. There will be no Stage 1 in-depth report on the implications of these powers being used, but neither will there ever be a Stage 1 report on the use of these powers to change the way in which long-term prisoners are released if we vote for this bill this evening. I don't accept that this is the way that we should do legislation in this Parliament. We don't know what's in the government's minds, how they plan to use it, if at all. Do they plan to use it to revert back to the two-thirds policy, or is it another release point? As I said, the state of our prison remains a live human rights issue. HMIC have reported year-on-year concerns about conditions in Scottish prisoners. In fact, many prisoners have actually written to me expressing their concerns about not being able to go on a rehabilitation programme, and it appears there is a long waiting list for that. That is a subject I would like the Criminal Justice Committee to look at, given its importance to reducing reoffending rates. In conclusion, we will continue to scrutinise the release of the prison programme should this bill be passed into law. We will oppose it tonight, but if it passes, we will still demand the resources necessary to make sure that early release of prisoners does not put our communities more at risk, and that victims get better notification for the implications to their lives of this policy.
Thank you, Ms McNeill. I now call on Maggie Chapman to open on behalf of the Scottish Greens. Up to 4 minutes, please.
Thank you, Presiding Officer. Criminal justice is about people. People who cause and experience harm. People who represent, judge and sentence them. People who support and help. People who speak the truths we need to hear. One man has been, at different times of his life, many of those people. His story and his work are familiar to many of us. His name is Kevin Neary. Kevin is an extraordinary man, but the first part of his life story is far from unusual. Like many, he was trapped in the revolving door we spoke of last week, between Scotland's prisons and an outside world that is brutal and traumatic for children in poverty and the adults they become. He grew up in a Glasgow tenement flat with parents who loved him and his brothers and sisters, but for whom alcohol abuse was the only way to survive the stress and deaden the pain. He saw violence around him in his home and on the street, witnessing when he was only 4 what seemed to the children to be a fatal knife attack on their father. At school, he was afraid, with toxic stress blocking his ability to read along with the class. So he would create distractions for which he was punished with blows from the belt, sometimes several times a day. At secondary school, his parents couldn't buy him a tie, and that absence around his neck was all the teachers seemed to see. He skipped school, and at 13 he too began drinking to find those moments of peace. Talking about his life as a child on the Community Pioneers podcast, he explained, "I wanted to be everyone else. I didn't want to be me." Drink turned to drugs, including heroin and crack cocaine. Childhood misdemeanours turned into adult offences with repeated prison sentences over 3 decades. He might still be there, one of the increasing number of men living out their old age in Scotland's prisons. But at the age of 40, serving a sentence for assault and robbery, something new happened. A prison officer called him by his first name, asked to chat with him, told him about the rehabilitation programmes that could help him end his addictions. That contact and care, those programmes were enough to transform Kevin Neary's life. Now he works to help others at both ends of the prison process. He shares his own experiences in vital prevention works in schools. And as a co-founder of Aid and Abet, he supports people leaving prison so that, in the words of the charity, once someone has been in prison, they need never go back there. It is a life story with many lessons for us about the long-term effects of childhood poverty and trauma, about education and exclusion, about the power of those with lived experience to make transformational change. But for now, for us here tonight, there is one more lesson to learn. If that one prison officer had not had the time to speak to Kevin as an individual, to spend time in conversation with him, to hear about his life, and to signpost the way ahead, if the prison authorities hadn't had the capacity to run those courses, if all they could do was keep him confined, along with all the other human beings for whom they are called upon to care, what then? If we are serious about rehabilitation, we must make space and time for it to happen. That requires staff, that requires space, and I believe that requires this bill. It is only one small part of that process, but it is, I believe, an essential one. Thank you.
Thank you, Ms Chapman. And I now call on Liam MacArthur to open on behalf of the Scottish Liberal Democrats. Up to 4 minutes, please.
Thank you, Presiding Officer. As colleagues will be aware, I was unable to participate in the Stage 2 proceedings, so I very much welcome the chance to make a contribution here at Stage 3. Can I thank all those both inside the Parliament and outside who have been operating under severe time pressures to try and scrutinise and amend this bill. And the approaches have differed. Some have taken a more forensic approach. Mr Kerr maybe perhaps a more blunt approach, but nevertheless I thank them for their efforts over the course of stages 2 and 3. I'll keep my contribution brief, partly because of the lateness of the hour, but mostly because I said most of what I needed to say during the stage 1 debate last Thursday, and an awful lot has changed since then. A week may be a long time in politics, but it appears to be just about enough time for this government to pass 2 separate pieces of emergency legislation where it's so minded. And the problem we're dealing with here, as I said on Thursday last week, has been years in the making. It seems to be, I think, acknowledged around the Chamber. Not enough focus, I believe, has gone into reducing rates of incarceration, alternatives to custody, rehabilitation programmes, diversionary approaches, youth works, and indeed the work of Kevin Neary referred to by Maggie Chapman there. We're now on to our second early release programme in less than 2 months, and we're being asked to do this in a rushed fashion. But I think the thing that troubles me most about this bill, and I said this again at stage 1, was the fact that the bill seeks to extend ministerial powers over a complex area of policy that needs and indeed demands robust and detailed scrutiny. There's undoubtedly been improvements made, and I would commend Polly McNeill and Sharon Dowie for the work they've done in relation to the information provided to victims. I'd also, I think, acknowledge the Cabinet Secretary's willingness to engage in those debates and I think take as constructive approach on this issue as she has in other areas of the justice portfolio. I'm not a fan of sunset clauses, but I'm not a fan of emergency legislation either. And this must be one of these rare occasions where 2 wrongs just about make a right, or something that is at least palatable. Unfortunately, those calls also fell on deaf ears. But again, I thank Jamie Green and Polly McNeill for their efforts in that regard. Look, I, like everybody else, acknowledge the urgency, the seriousness of the situation, the risk to staff welfare across the prison estate, as well as to prisoners and our communities from the unsafe state our prisons are in, bursting as the seams as they are. I recognise too the need to buy time, as Maggie Chapman just referred to, allow medium and longer term measures to have an effect to bring down the size of our prison population, not least the numbers on remand. But As I said in relation to Martin Whitfield's amendment earlier, the refusal of the Government to take account of genuine, serious and cross-party concerns regarding the inclusion of order-making powers in Section 3, reducing the future scrutiny role of this Parliament, for me, for Scottish Liberal Democrats, is the step too far, and for that reason we will not be supporting the bill at decision time this evening.
Thank you, Mr MacArthur. And in fact, we will now move to closing speeches, and I call on Maggie Chapman to close on behalf of the Scottish Greens. Up to 4 minutes, please.
Thank you, Presiding Officer. I'd like to put on record my sincere thanks to all the parliamentary staff who have supported the passage of this bill, from last week through to this evening. From the legislation and business teams to the catering and security staff. We can only be here this evening because of them. Thanks to Theresa Medhurst and all of her prison staff who work in increasingly difficult, stressful and exhausting circumstances to transform the lives of the people in their care. I'm grateful too to members in this chamber for another thoughtful debate. I'd just like to pick up on a few points from today and last week. We've heard a lot about risk and harm, but there are many kinds of risk, and failing to act doesn't eliminate them. We are failing in our duty if we use fears of theoretical short-term risks as excuses for inaction, allowing more serious long-term dangers to accumulate. Prisons are not safe places, but they can become relatively safer if there are sufficient staff, educational and rehabilitative resources, and clear, accessible and achievable pathways to progression. Where prisons are overcrowded, with insufficient staff time and resources, we see deteriorations in mental and physical health, loss of hope and respect, increased addiction and involvement in serious organised crime. Those are real and serious dangers to prisoners, to survivors, to families and communities. With regard to longer-term prisoners, as my amendment underlined, it is vital that the work of consultation and debate is comprehensive and robust. The situation that we have at the moment has, of course, only existed for a relatively short period since the 2015 Act came into force, and so we do have a considerable fund of information and experience available from before that date. There has been a widespread recognition, not only within this jurisdiction, that the approach typified by the 2015 Act maybe hasn't worked as well as we hoped, and Pauline McNeill alluded to this earlier. We have consequent problems of overcrowding, cost, a lack of staff time for rehabilitation, and insufficient time in the community for those leaving prison on licence to receive the support they need. That's perhaps especially true for those serving long sentences, for whom the outside world can not only be hostile, but also cold and unfamiliar and bereft of any friends and family members. Finally, Presiding Officer, I and the Scottish Greens, in supporting today's bill, are under no illusion that it represents anything like all we need to do. As I set out in my closing speech for Stage 1 last week, there are many other areas that we, as a Parliament, need to prioritise if we are to address the overlapping crises which come together in our criminal justice system. We need effective prevention, beginning with acknowledging, preventing and treating childhood trauma. We need alternative responses to crime that meet the needs of victims and survivors, communities and those who have caused harm. And we need secure and long-term resourcing for both public and third sectors. I look forward to cooperation across the Chamber to achieve those ends, with today's legislation being a crucial part. And I am pleased that we will support this bill when we vote at decision time. Thank you.
Thank you, Ms Chapman. I now call on Martin Whitfield to close on behalf of Scottish Labour. Up to 4 minutes, please.
I'm very grateful, Deputy Presiding Officer. And can I echo Maggie Chapman and others in my thanks to all of those that have supported us in here today, both within the Parliament, within our own offices, and ironically perhaps even in our own homes waiting for us. It is with some disappointment that I find myself at this position with regard to this bill. It is accepted that there is an emergency with regard to the overcrowding in our prisons and the quality of our prison estate. However, for it to get to a point where emergency legislation is required to pass through this House so that prisoners can be released early shows, I think, a failure both of perhaps this Parliament, but certainly this government, not to see something that was blatantly obvious to people working within the prison service, people who have responsibility for the management and control of our prisons, for those that help people outside in our communities, that there is a massive challenge with regard to locking people up and then doing nothing. It comes back to remind you that it is still there. So it is with a great disappointment that we were faced with emergency legislation regarding this matter. And as I highlighted before, and as many others have, this is in fact two bills that have been pushed together. And with regard to Section 3 and the long-term prisoners, we have not really had an explanation about why it is urgent. Yes, it is complex. Yes, it is important. But why it is urgent has eluded us. And perhaps it's a missed opportunity for a committee to have looked in depth at it to reach what has been offered by a number of contributions across this chamber, perhaps a consensus on how we move forward. In the short time that I have, I want to again raise, and I have no fear in doing so, the situation with regard to young people and children with regard to this bill. The children who are the victims, the children who, if they are 12 or under, are not able to register and require others, usually their parents or carers, to do so. The children who are offenders, for whom the UNCRC sets out that we should always have the best interests of the child as foremost. And yet the explanation for their inclusion within this, in a part of the detention service where there is no overcrowding, is it makes it the same as adults. And for those children who are the children of offenders who may be released, I welcome the Cabinet Secretary's assurances and undertaking to reach out and work with those that represent young people, that speak on their behalf, and indeed many of them have sent in views and opinions on the process during the procedure of this bill. I would hope, in summing up, that the Cabinet Secretary will also say that she will reach out to young people and children themselves to hear their voices, to hear the voices of those children who are concerned should a parent be returning to their house, to those children who have, and for complex reasons, found themselves offenders within the situation, but also those children who are victims, who are very concerned about what may happen, and do not understand that the Scottish Government doesn't understand the difference between 40% and 50%, or don't understand how to access, or are challenged to get the support. And I welcome and I will hold the Scottish Government to their undertaking and assurance that funding will be available going forward, as this is now, or potentially will become permanent legislation, that support will always be there for those victims, for those offenders to return to society, and for those children of offenders who at the minute have a very quiet voice, but a voice that should be listened to. I am very conscious of time, and my last summing up, Deputy Presiding Officer, is, was this not the bill to maintain the Scottish Government's promise of post-legislative scrutiny? I'm grateful.
Thank you, Mr Whitfield. I now call on Jamie Green to close on behalf of the Scottish Conservatives. Up to 4 minutes, please.
Thank you. Of course, I'm disappointed by the speed at which we've rushed through this bill. But I have to say, actually, I've been impressed by the sincerity and quality of the debate that we've had over this last week. And whilst I found the process disappointing, I do believe that this bill is all the worse for the lack of consultation that I think it was due and that it deserved. Because actually what I did want to do is to hear from experts in their fields about some of the wider issues that this bill raised, the issues about reoffending and rehabilitation, the proper discussion that we could have had about optimum prison sentence lengths, and what early release actually means to the victim of a crime. I want to hear their real lived experiences of what has happened to them when this Parliament legislates to release people early. What does it feel like to be that victim at the other end of the phone when a prisoner from inside prison harasses them in advance of their release? We know that it's happened. These are the sorts of people that I wanted to hear. I wanted to hear from offenders themselves. What happens when you're chucked out of prison and you've got nowhere to go, no support, no supervision? What happens when you find yourself back in custody after just a few weeks or even days? Those are the sorts of debates and conversations that I did want to have, but we haven't had. And as a real-life example I mentioned earlier, we've been negotiating with organisations like Victim Support Scotland and Scottish Women's Aid, real-life organisations out there at the front end, the sorts of organisations that we all say, oh, we support them, with what great work they do. But when they come to us begging us to amend bills in the way that they see fit that will protect victims, we're unable to. That's no way to legislate, because the sort of last-minute negotiations that I was having with parliamentary drafters would have meant I would have submitted amendments at stage 3 that were completely incoherent and probably not fit for purpose. But that's no way to legislate. The Scottish Government has said time after time that the current prison population is the reason for this bill. It makes it impossible to keep people safe and to rehabilitate people. But in the same breath, it voted down amendments that actually required prisoners to engage in rehabilitation. It voted down amendments today that would actually look at alternatives. For example, the use of community sentencing as alternatives. And ministers have repeated this mantra numerous times, that sentencing decisions are ultimately independent matters for independent judges. And we've heard it time after time after time, and that may be the case. So therefore, why are we rushing through legislation which alters the very outcome of those sentences which were handed down independently in the first place? We can't pretend it's not happening. And the argument being that, of course, this is legitimately within the gift of ministers, which it is. But in my view, that does not make it right, no matter which government does it, and I put that on the record. I think we are at serious risk here, and I don't say this lightly, of getting to the point where the value of a sentence which is handed out by a sheriff or a judge is utterly meaningless relative to the sentence that will actually be served. Because I think at that point, that's where the public do lose faith in the justice system, and they probably rightly lose faith in us as well. Now, I'm grateful to get a review into the Act, but it wasn't a sunset clause. I said at the beginning of this whole process that my intention was to improve the bill in any way that I could, even if I ultimately disagreed with it, and I've done that to my best efforts. But the most egregious of decisions that was made today was that of my amendment to exclude those who are serving a sentence for attacking emergency workers from being early released. I simply pose the following moral question to colleagues in the Chamber today. Why on earth should they benefit from early release? And no one has been able to answer that question. You will need to look those blue light service workers in the eye the next time you meet them. Our votes here have consequences. Bills have consequences. And I said it last week, if this Parliament votes to pass this bill and it leads to a single victim of crime as a result of it, then we owe them an apology. Because whatever your views on incarceration as a means of punishment or rehabilitation, public safety must come first. And this bill fails to meet that test, and it is for that reason that I cannot support it. Presiding Officer.
Thank you, Mr Green. And I now call on Cabinet Secretary Angela Constance to wind up the debate. Up to 5 minutes, please, Cabinet Secretary.
Thank you very much, Presiding Officer. Can I start by thanking my officials within the Scottish Government for all their work, and also the parliamentary officials too. And I also want to extend my thanks to all members who have contributed to the debates in and around this bill. I do want to assure you all that emergency legislation is not my default position. But I have, even when we have disagreed, appreciated the engagement with members across the political divide, even when at times I've been challenged on the resources for implementation, and then when people have complained about the cost when I deliver those resources to the Daily Mail or whatever. Because fundamentally, I believe it's not unreasonable for members of the public, or indeed for any member of this Parliament, to ask how this bill makes them safer and why people are having their sentences reduced. And the answer to this, in short, is that we all have a vested interest in rehabilitation, but that has to be a rehabilitation that works. Rehabilitation is, of course, about challenging people on their behaviour, but it's also about engaging them, and it's also about the importance of relationships. It's not about enforcement or indeed tick-box exercises. And I know at the start of, I think it was the Stage 1 debate, that both Liam Kerr and Liam MacArthur made a reference to me in the context of having a hospital pass, which of course is somewhat wry for me as a former prison social worker, but also as a former hospital social worker in a psychiatric hospital. There's two things I know in my bones. I know that right now, neither Liam would swap places with me right now, because you both have a luxury that I don't have. And despite the challenges, Presiding Officer, right now there is no other job I would choose to do. And I know that I'm not alone in this. But this work for me is both deeply personal as well as political. And yes, I'm a 54-year-old woman who's grown up in a society that has endemic misogyny and where violence against women and girls remains endemic and continues to be on the rise. Yes, I'm the Cabinet Secretary for Justice and Home Affairs, and yes, I'm a former prison social worker. Often forget I'm a politician and still think of myself as a social worker. It is not a choice between supporting prison staff, supporting victims, or indeed supporting prisoners. We have to be delivering for everyone. And I go back to this again with the letter that I received, that we all received from the Prison Officers Association, when they said, I don't think it will come as a surprise to anyone that while we are extremely proud of the incredible work our members are doing on a daily basis in our prisons, we are extremely fearful for their physical and mental health the longer they are asked to put themselves in harm's way. And that's why I need to take and I need to lead action now. And I don't have the luxury of not pursuing every option available to me. I will in a moment, Mr MacArthur, time permitting. Presiding Officer, when the population in custody is high and complex, where we have vulnerable people mixed in with dangerous, serious organised crime nominals, rehabilitative activities are indeed curtailed. Time in their cells has increased, tensions are raised, relationships strained, frustrations boil over into violence. And maybe for some people there is some sort of reassurance that, well, it's behind prison walls. But prisons are not the end of the line. They should not be out of sight, out of mind. What happens in that space before release, and crucially what happens after release, matters. And that actually matters much more than whether the release point is at 50% of the sentence or 40%. And yes, I believe in punishment, I believe in protection of the public, but I also in equal measure believe in rehabilitation and reintegration. Because if they are not safely accommodated, if our prisons do not control and care for those who pose the greatest risk to our society, there will be more victims in prison, but there will also be more victims in our community. Most prisoners return to our communities, Presiding Officer. Most of them will return to our communities, so we need to be invested in changing lives for safer communities, and that of course includes for our children as well. Presiding Officer, my apologies deeply to Mr MacArthur, but this bill, I accept, is not a panacea. It will reduce the prison population from what it would otherwise be, but it is a necessary step. But I can assure you it will not be our last step. And the two Liams, Karen MacArthur and indeed Mr Green, perhaps should be a wee bit careful for what you wish for, because I intend to see this through. And I very much hope that the gentleman will join me too in this endeavour, because we have to move beyond the narrative, move beyond the problem of why, and get to the how and the when. And my very final word, Presiding Officer, is yes, we can critique the past, debate the future, but the question tonight is now. We need to move beyond the why. We know why. This is about the how and the when is now, Presiding Officer.
Thank you. That concludes the debate on Prisoners' Early Release Scotland Bill at Stage 3. We will now move to the question on the motion, and I'm going to suspend for a few moments to allow members to sign back in to the digital voting system.